July 14, 1944. A clearing behind the lines in the Normandy countryside of France. A Sherman tank sat idling in front of an ancient earthen wall. The wall was not a wall in any ordinary sense. It was a living fortress of roots and packed dirt, standing nearly 6 feet high and 10 feet wide at its base, crowned by decades of tangled oak and hawthorn, pushing the total height to 15 feet or more. Every American commander in Normandy knew what happened next when a tank tried to cross one of these things. The nose tipped up, the belly exposed itself, and the enemy fired, every time. But this time something was different. 4 steel prongs, cut from German beach obstacles and welded to the lower front hull of the tank, jutted forward like tusks. The tank revved its engine. It drove at the wall. The prongs bit into the earth. The tank did not tip. It did not slow. The earthen bank split apart. Dirt flew in all directions. The tank drove through in seconds and sat in the field on the other side, engine still running. General Omar N. Bradley, commanding the 1st United States Army, watched from a few yards away. He turned to the officers beside him and said nothing for a moment. Then he ordered every ordnance unit in his army to begin producing this device immediately, around the clock. The man who designed those prongs was a 29-year-old sergeant from Cranford, New Jersey. His name was Curtis Culin III. He was not an engineer. He was not an officer. He had picked up an idea another soldier had tossed out as a joke and turned it into something that helped break open the most important military campaign of the 20th century. This is the story of how the hedgerows of Normandy nearly stopped the liberation of Western Europe, and how ordinary American soldiers, through suffering and improvisation and a hard-won capacity to learn, turned those same hedgerows into a weapon the Germans could not answer. The Norman bocage was not built for war. It was built for farming. The word bocage comes from the old French word for grove, and the landscape it describes had been growing in the countryside of Lower Normandy for nearly 1,000 years before the first Allied soldier set foot on French soil. Medieval farmers had piled the heavy clay soil of the region into earthen banks to mark their individual plots, contain their cattle and horses, drain the waterlogged ground, and break the powerful winds that came in off the Atlantic. Over generations, seeds took root in those banks. Oak and beech and hawthorn and blackthorn grew on top of and through the packed earth. Their roots bound the soil into something as dense and hard as masonry. Coppiced regularly for firewood, trimmed back by animals grazing against them, the banks grew only more solid and more entangled with each passing decade. By the middle of the 20th century, the bocage covered most of the departments of Manche, Orne, and Calvados in Lower Normandy, spreading up to 50 miles inland from the sea. The United States Army's own Combat Lessons Bulletin, published in 1944, described these structures in precise terms. The earthen base of a typical Norman hedgerow measured 8 to 10 feet wide at its foundation and 4 to 6 feet in height. The vegetation growing from the top added another 9 feet or more. An aerial photograph taken over the American sector counted roughly 3,900 hedgerow-enclosed fields within just 8 square miles of Normandy countryside. That works out to nearly 500 individual enclosed fields in every square mile of fighting ground. The sunken cart tracks connecting those fields, worn down by centuries of wagon traffic, dropped several feet below the field level. They were narrow enough to channel a single vehicle at a time, turning every dirt lane into a prepared ambush. For the Norman farming families who had worked this land for generations, these banks were the geography of daily life. They represented the inheritance passed from father to child, the boundary of one man's labor from his neighbors. The small orchards of apple and pear trees behind each farm produced the cider and calvados that gave the region its identity. The cattle that stood in the enclosed fields were the economic foundation of the countryside. When the war arrived, those same farmers watched the landscape they had cultivated for generations become the site of an industrial slaughter that would destroy much of it forever. By the summer of 1944, the war in Western Europe had reached a moment unlike any that had come before it. The Allied invasion of Nazi-occupied France, the largest seaborne military operation in history, had gone ashore on 5 Normandy beaches on June 6, 1944. Nearly 156,000 Allied troops landed on that single day. The strategic plan, called Operation Overlord, had been conceived and refined over 2 years. General Dwight D. Eisenhower commanded the Supreme Headquarters Allied Expeditionary Force. Field Marshal Bernard Law Montgomery commanded the 21st Army Group, which included the British and Canadian forces striking at Caen in the east, and the American forces pushing inland from Utah Beach and Omaha Beach on the western flank. Bradley's 1st United States Army was the American ground force that went ashore that day. On the right flank, Major General J. Lawton Collins commanded the 7th Corps, landing the 4th Infantry Division at Utah Beach, alongside the airborne forces of the 82nd Airborne Division under Major General Matthew B. Ridgway and the 101st Airborne Division under Major General Maxwell D. Taylor both dropped inland by parachute in the early hours before dawn. On the left, Major General Leonard T. Garrow's 5th Corps put the 1st Infantry Division and the 29th Infantry Division onto the killing ground of Omaha Beach. By nightfall on June 6th, the Allies had established a lodgment. The beachhead was won. What awaited inland was something no amount of planning had truly prepared them for. Back in England, during the months of preparation before the invasion, American planners had studied aerial photographs and terrain maps of Normandy in meticulous detail. The photographs clearly showed the hedged field systems of the bocage. Reports from French resistance contacts described the walls in physical terms. Training exercises had been run over English countryside hedgerows to prepare infantry for enclosed terrain. The consensus view was that the bocage would complicate operations, and that, determined, aggressive infantry would push through it quickly. What the planners could not simulate was the physical reality of those Norman earthen banks. English hedgerows were trimmed vegetation growing from flat ground. Norman hedgerows were ancient fortifications rooted in solid earthen mounds. No British or American tank commander in England had driven a Sherman at a Norman bocage wall and watched his barrel tip toward the sky. No infantryman had tried to sprint across a Norman field 30 yards wide, with machine guns sighted in on every corner and mortar rounds registered on every square foot of open ground. Brigadier General James Gavin, Assistant Commander of the 82nd Airborne, later reflected that although there had been some talk in England before the landings about the hedgerows, none of them had really appreciated how difficult they would turn out to be. General Bradley himself, riding through the Norman countryside on the morning of June 8th, called it the damnedest country he had seen. One day later, Collins told Bradley that the bocage was as bad as anything he had faced on Guadalcanal. There was a particular cruelty in this. The training had not been useless. The soldiers were fit, disciplined, and in many cases combat-hardened from North Africa and the Pacific. The equipment was serviceable. The plan was sound in its broad outlines. What no training area in England could replicate was the specific combination of physical barrier, German defensive preparation, and close terrain that made the Norman bocage something qualitatively different from any obstacle American forces had previously encountered. The men who walked into those fields on June 7th and June 8th were not unprepared soldiers. They were well-prepared soldiers, meeting a problem their preparation had not specifically addressed. The cost of that gap was measured in hundreds of yards and thousands of lives. The tactical crisis that descended on 1st United States Army in those first days had a brutal geometry to it. Each small field enclosed by the bocage walls was typically 50 to 100 yards across. A Sherman tank attempting to drive over the earthen bank tipped upward as it climbed, exposing the thinner armor of its belly to whatever weapon the Germans had waiting on the other side. A Panzerfaust rocket, a 75mm anti-tank gun, a mine planted at the base, all could kill the tank while it was helplessly pointing its cannon at the sky. Once the crew knew they could not cross the wall under fire, they pulled back. The tank became a stationary steel box that the enemy could approach and destroy at leisure. Infantry fared no better. Advancing across an open field in the bocage meant walking directly into pre-registered machine gun fire from the far corners, where German machine gun teams had been sighted specifically to deliver diagonal fire across the open ground. The MG-42, the standard German general-purpose machine gun, fired 1,200 rounds per minute. At 50 yards, there was no cover and no defilade. Mortar rounds were pre-plotted on every field. German forward observers sat in the hedgerows and called corrections by radio. A platoon could lose half its men crossing a single field and still not reach the next hedgerow. German artillery, carefully pre-registered on every field, inflicted the majority of American casualties during the bocage campaign. By some estimates, as much as 3/4 of all wounds sustained. An enemy forward observer hidden 20 yards away in vegetation that was itself a fortification could call down a fire mission in minutes. The German mortars were particularly deadly. The 81mm mortar could be moved through the sunken lanes and repositioned before American artillery could locate and engage it. A crew could fire, collapse their tube, move 200 yards through a hedged lane, and fire again before the Americans had finished reporting the first position. The landscape enabled this kind of mobile, indirect fire in ways that open terrain never could. The German infantrymen in the bocage had one additional advantage that American planners had not fully anticipated. He knew from weeks of preparation exactly where the American infantry would have to cross. There were only so many gates and gaps in each hedgerow. Machine guns sighted diagonally across a field covered both the open ground and the crossing points simultaneously. It was, as one American regimental commander wrote in his after-action report, as though the enemy had been living in these fields for years and knew every inch of them. In a real sense, the defenders had been. The German 7th Army had been responsible for coastal defense of Brittany and Normandy since 1941, and its infantry had spent years studying the terrain and registering their weapons on every piece of open ground they could identify. The Germans defending this ground were not improvised garrison troops. The 352nd Infantry Division under General Lieutenant Dietrich Kreis, the veteran formation that had savaged the Americans at Omaha Beach on D-Day, fought a disciplined elastic defense from field to field, counterattacking through the hedgerows at night to collapse American gains before they could be consolidated. The 6th Fallschirmjäger Regiment under Oberstleutnant Friedrich August Freiherr von der Heydte defended Carentan and its approaches with parachute infantry, whose training and fighting quality was among the best in the German military. The 3rd Fallschirmjäger Division under General Lieutenant Richard Schimpf held the high ground around Hill 192 and the approaches to Saint-Lô, while General der Fallschirmtruppe, Eugen Meindl, commanded the broader 2nd Fallschirm Corps, overseeing parachute operations across the sector. The 17th SS Panzer Grenadier Division struck the American airborne at Carentan with armor-supported counterattacks that almost retook the town in mid-June. And the Panzer Lehr Division under General Lieutenant Fritz Bayerlein, one of the most capable armored formations in the German army, was transferred into the American sector in early July and anchored the line west of Saint-Lô in the critical weeks before the breakout. Field Marshal Erwin Rommel commanded Army Group B from his headquarters at La Roche-Guyon. His defensive doctrine called for fighting forward, keeping the Americans entangled in the hedgerows, where their air power and artillery superiority would be blunted by the terrain. Every day the Allies spent bleeding in the bocage was a day the Germans used to reinforce, regroup, and prepare deeper positions. The Battle of Carentan, fought from June 10th to June 13th, 1944, illustrated what the hedgerows cost in human terms. Lieutenant Colonel Robert G. Cole commanded the 3rd Battalion, 502nd Parachute Infantry of the 101st Airborne Division. His men had been fighting across the flooded Douve River causeway under continuous fire for days. The way into Carentan ran through a sunken road bordered by hedgerows on both sides. Fire from German paratroopers dug into those hedgerows, stopped every advance by fire and movement. Cole ordered a bayonet charge. He blew his whistle and ran forward. Of the 265 men who started across that open ground, 130 were killed or wounded. Cole received the Medal of Honor for the action. He was killed by a sniper at Best in the Netherlands during Operation Market Garden 3 months later. The medal was presented on October 30, 1944, at Fort Sam Houston in Texas, to his mother, with his widow present at the ceremony, roughly 6 weeks after he fell. And that was just one battalion on one afternoon in one corner of a front that stretched for dozens of miles in every direction. Through the rest of June and into July, the pattern repeated itself across the entire American sector. The 90th Infantry Division, sent into the difficult hedgerows west of the Murderette River, suffered so badly that successive division commanders were relieved. The division bled heavily through June and July, and in a single action on July 23rd at the Sevis Island position, 250 or more men from the division, including multiple battalion commanders, were taken prisoner, one of the largest single surrenders of American soldiers in the Normandy campaign. The 2nd Infantry Division under Major General Walter M. Robertson fought an entire month for Hill 192, a low ridge dominating the main road to Saint-Lô. The division finally took the hill on July 11th, 1944, at a cost over the full month-long battle of more than 594 killed and roughly 3,000 wounded. A single regiment, the 23rd Infantry, lost 234 men killed in that battle alone. The numbers across the front were staggering. By early July, Collins reported over 22,000 casualties in the 7th Corps alone, including 2,800 killed and 5,650 men listed as missing. The Allied lodgement as a whole had suffered roughly 60,000 casualties by that date, with fewer than 20 miles of ground gained inland from the beaches in most sectors. American divisions were advancing sometimes no more than a few hundred yards per day, paying for each field with the lives of men who had landed confident they would be through the bocage and rolling toward Paris within weeks. Bradley described sitting with his staff in those weeks trying to figure out why the army was bleeding so heavily for so little ground. The problem was not courage. The problem was tactical. The tank and the infantryman were fighting separately when the ground demanded they fight as one organism, in intimate and immediate support, at ranges sometimes measured in tens of yards. Behind those numbers were specific faces and specific names, the junior officers and sergeants who led squads across open fields under machine gun fire, the tank crews who burned inside their Shermans when a Panzerfaust found the gap above the tracks, the medics who worked in the sunken lanes trying to reach men who could not be reached in time, the paratroopers who landed in flooded fields in the dark on June 6th and never found their units. Many of these men had been in the army for 2 years or less. Some had never left their home states before enlisting. The men killed in the bocage did not die charging machine guns in a blaze of visible heroism. Most died in small groups crossing small fields or under mortar fire in lanes they could not escape. Their deaths were largely invisible to the wider world and to each other. A man could be killed in a hedgerow 30 yards from the nearest road and not be found for hours. The grinding nature of this kind of warfare was especially hard on the young officers and non-commissioned officers who led at the squad and platoon level, because the bocage offered no opportunity to use skill or experience to avoid fire. There were simply too many hedgerows, too many fields, and too many Germans waiting in each one. The families at home received their news through official telegrams and through letters that arrived days or weeks after they were written, if they arrived at all. The War Department's system for notifying next of kin was efficient by the standards of the era, but could not soften the particular cruelty of the timing. Wives who had memorized the return address on every envelope learned to recognize the Western Union messenger. Children who were too young to understand what the war was could sense what it meant when their mother's face changed at the door. Every American unit in the bocage was searching for an answer by late June. Different battalions and regiments reached different conclusions. Engineers tried demolitions, blowing gaps in the banks with large explosive charges, but the charges required enormous quantities of material and took too long to emplace under fire. Bulldozers were tried, but the bocage roots defeated their blades, and they drew fire instantly. Some tank crews tried using their guns to blast through the banks, but the earthen walls simply absorbed the shells. Others tried driving through at angles, but the geometry of the fields made this useless in most situations. In those same weeks, a quieter set of conversations was happening at the squad and platoon level, the kind of problem-solving that does not appear in formal after-action reports, but that shapes battles nonetheless. Soldiers who had been in the bocage for weeks were talking about what worked and what did not. In one of those conversations, in a unit of the 102nd Cavalry Reconnaissance Squadron, a New Jersey National Guard formation serving as a corps-level reconnaissance unit under 5th Corps, a soldier named Roberts made what the other men around him apparently treated as an offhand remark. He said they ought to put saw teeth on the front of a tank and let it chew through the hedgerows like a machine. The men laughed. Sergeant Curtis Culin III did not laugh. He listened. Culin was 29 years old. He had grown up in Cranford, New Jersey, and worked as a salesman before the war. He had no formal engineering training. What he had was the ability to look at a practical problem and imagine a mechanical solution, and the will to actually build it. He designed and supervised the welding of a set of 4 steel prongs to the lower front hull of a light tank. The prongs were cut from German anti-tank beach obstacles, the steel Czech hedgehogs that Rommel's engineers had planted along the waterline to impale landing craft. American soldiers had pulled them off the beaches and stacked them as scrap. That scrap steel was now about to change the war. When a tank fitted with Culin's device drove into a hedgerow at around 10 miles per hour, the prongs bit into the earthen bank and held the nose down. The tank's weight and engine power did the rest. The bank split apart, the vegetation tore free, and the tank drove through in seconds, emerging on the other side on level ground, with its gun still pointing forward and its belly still armored. The tank crew could see ahead. They could shoot. They had not exposed themselves to the enemy during the breach. Gero watched the demonstration on July 14, 1944, and immediately summoned Bradley to see it for himself. Bradley watched as the tank ran at the hedgerow and punched through it. His account of that moment, written later, called the device absurdly simple, and noted that it had baffled an entire army for more than 5 weeks before a 29-year-old sergeant from New Jersey solved it with German scrap steel. Bradley called Colonel John B. Medaris of 1st Army Ordnance and ordered round-the-clock production. Welding equipment was flown in from England. Ordnance units worked through the nights. Between July 14th and July 25th, 1944, over 500 devices were produced and fitted to Sherman tanks across 1st Army. By the morning of July 25th, roughly 60% of 1st Army's Shermans had been fitted with the device. The 2nd Armoured Division came closest to full conversion, with nearly 75% of its tanks equipped. The device became known by several names: the Rhinoceros, the Rhino tank, and the Culin hedgerow cutter. British Royal Electrical and Mechanical Engineers produced a parallel version for British and Canadian formations, eventually fitting roughly 2,100 tanks. Culin was awarded the Legion of Merit for his invention. He received no commission, no promotion, and relatively little public attention during the campaign itself. Bradley mentioned him by name in a post-war memoir. Eisenhower cited him by name in his televised farewell address to the nation on January 17, 1961. And again in the CBS documentary D-Day Plus 20 Years filmed at Normandy in 1964. The sergeant himself, characteristically, tried to give credit to Roberts, the soldier whose offhand remark had started the whole thing. History, compressing complex events into simple stories, gave the credit to Culin. 4 months after his device helped crack open Normandy, Culin was serving in the Hurtgen forest in Germany when he lost his left leg to a landmine. He came home to New Jersey, resumed civilian life, and died in 1963 at the age of 48. But the Rhino device was not the only solution being developed in parallel across 1st Army. What made the breakthrough at Normandy possible was not a single invention, but an entire organic process of tactical reinvention happening simultaneously at the squad, platoon, company, and division level. Major General Charles H. Gerhardt of the 29th Infantry Division and Brigadier General Norman D. Cotter had developed a combined arms assault method and rehearsed it behind the lines beginning on June 24, 1944. Their model assigned a standard assault team to each hedgerow crossing: 1 Sherman tank, 1 infantry squad of 12 men, 1 light machine gun, 1 60mm mortar, 1 engineer team carrying demolition charges, and 1 artillery forward observer. The team fought as a single organism. The tanks suppressed the far corners of the next field with 30 caliber and 50 caliber fire and point-blank 75mm rounds. The engineers breached the bank. The infantry crossed under the covering fire and cleared the next field. Then the process repeated. Tank infantry communication had been a persistent failure in the bocage, with infantrymen unable to talk to tank crews without climbing onto the vehicle or pounding on the hull. The solution that spread across 1st Army was a field telephone, the EE-8 model, mounted in an ammunition box welded to the rear of the Sherman's hull and wired into the tank's intercom system. A dismounted infantryman could pick up the handset and speak directly to the tank commander without either man exposing himself. Its adoption across multiple divisions in late June and early July of 1944 represented a genuine tactical advance that multiplied the effectiveness of the combined arms teams being developed simultaneously. Explosive breaching was systematized too. Lieutenant Colonel Robert R. Ploger's 121st Engineer Combat Battalion, working with the 747th Tank Battalion attached to the 29th Division, developed a method using 2 4-foot lengths of commercial pipe welded to the front of Sherman tanks to punch holes into hedgerow banks. 15-pound-shaped charges were packed into expended 105mm artillery shell casings and pushed into those holes. When detonated, The charges blew a gap large enough for infantry to cross without waiting for the tank to breach the full bank. Ploger calculated that his original 50-pound pole charge approach would have required 17 tons of explosives per tank company per mile and a half of bocage. The shell casing version was logistically manageable. What distinguished this entire wave of innovation was its speed. Methods tried by one battalion were circulating through adjacent units within days. Bradley's staff collected after-action reports and distilled the practical findings into mimeographed circulars distributed down to company level. Officers who had found something that worked were sent to brief neighboring units rather than writing formal memoranda that would take weeks to travel through proper channels. The First Army's approach to sharing battlefield knowledge compressed what might otherwise have been months of institutional learning into days. The artillery pieces that had previously been firing in support of whole regiments were now being pushed down to support individual assault teams. A single 105mm howitzer battery could be assigned to support a company-sized hedgerow attack, with its forward observer walking directly behind the lead Sherman. American artillerymen, who had trained to support division-level operations on open terrain, adapted their techniques to a kind of precision the manuals had never anticipated. The artillery advantage the United States possessed over the Wehrmacht was substantial, and learning to apply it at the scale of a single field multiplied its effect dramatically. The city of Saint-Lô stood at the center of this grinding campaign, and its fall became the symbolic marker for the end of the bocage phase and the beginning of the breakout. Major General Gerhardt's 29th Infantry Division fought through the hedgerows south of Couvance for weeks, approaching Saint-Lô from the north, while the 2nd Infantry Division seized Hill 192 on its flank. Task Force C, under Brigadier General Normandy. Cota moved out from south of Couvance at 15:10 hours on July 18, 1944, and entered Saint-Lô by early evening. The city was essentially undefended by that point, reduced to rubble by weeks of Allied bombing and German artillery. A day earlier, on July 17th, Major Thomas D. Howe, commanding the 3rd Battalion of the 116th Infantry Regiment, was killed by mortar shrapnel at his battalion command post. That same morning he had told his division commander by telephone that he would see him in Saint-Lô. General Gerhardt ordered Howe's flag-draped body placed on the lead vehicle into the city as a tribute to the men who had died getting there. American newspapers began calling him the Major of Saint-Lô. Howe is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer. The city itself had been reduced to near-total ruin during the 6-week approach, with roughly 95% of its structures destroyed. Samuel Beckett, the Irish writer, came to Saint-Lô in August 1945 as quartermaster and interpreter for the Irish Red Cross Hospital Unit, arriving a full year after the liberation to help rebuild and supply the hospital the unit had established there. In June 1946, he wrote a short radio script about his experience among the ruins, intended for Radio Irian but never transmitted, and it gave readers the phrase, "capital of the ruins," which has been associated with Saint-Lô ever since. The fall of Saint-Lô gave Bradley the jumping-off point he needed. Operation Cobra launched at 11 in the morning on Tuesday, July 25, 1944. The plan called for the largest tactical airstrike the war had yet seen, to obliterate the German defensive line along the Saint-Lô-Two-Perriers road before the ground assault began. An abortive attempt the previous day, July 24th, had ended in partial disaster when more than 300 heavy bombers dropped their loads before a recall signal reached them all, killing approximately 25 Americans and wounding roughly 130 more. The July 25th operation went fully as ordered. Approximately 1,500 B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators of the 8th Air Force dropped more than 3,300 tons of bombs on a target rectangle, roughly 7,000 yards long and 20,000 yards long, 2,500 yards deep in front of the American lines. Medium bombers and fighter bombers of the 9th Air Force followed with nearly 1,000 more tons of bombs and napalm. More than 1,100 field artillery pieces fired simultaneously. The short bombing problem returned on July 25th itself. Bombs falling short of the target line killed approximately 111 American soldiers and wounded approximately 490 more, most of them from the 30th Infantry Division under Major General Leland S. Hobbs. Among the dead was Lieutenant General Lesley McNair, commander of Army Ground Forces, and the highest-ranking American officer to die in the European theater of operations. McNair had been observing the attack from a forward position with the 2nd Battalion of the 120th Infantry when a bomb landed in his slit trench. His death was kept secret for weeks to protect a strategic deception operation that had been using his name to suggest a phantom army group was still poised to land at Pas-de-Calais. He is buried at the Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer, in Plot F, Row 28, and Grave 42. Byerline, commanding Panzer Lehr Division, later claimed that roughly 70% of his division had been rendered combat ineffective by the bombing. He described the landscape afterward as a moonscape, in which movement had become impossible, and command had collapsed entirely. Whatever the precise scale of the damage, the result was undeniable. The German defensive line broke. Collins's 7th Corps drove through the gap. The 4th Infantry Division, the 9th Infantry Division under Major General Manton S. Eddy, and the 30th Infantry Division were the breach forces. The 2nd Armoured Division and the 3rd Armoured Division led the exploitation, with Rhino-equipped Shermans now driving through hedgerow banks in seconds rather than stopping dead in front of them. The difference in mobility was immediate and visible. Where American tank crews had spent weeks measuring their progress in yards, they were now covering kilometers in a single morning. Coutances fell on July 28th. On July 29th, fighter-bombers of the 9th Air Force caught the retreating German columns in a pocket near Roncey and destroyed approximately 66 tanks, over 200 vehicles, and 11 artillery pieces in a single afternoon, one of the most devastating air attacks on a ground force in the entire Western campaign. Avranches, the gateway to Brittany and the open country beyond, fell on July 30th when the 4th Armoured Division entered the town, with the city fully secured the following day. At noon on August 1st, 1944, Lieutenant General George S. Patton Jr.'s 3rd United States Army was activated. Bradley moved up to command the 12th Army Group. Lieutenant General Courtney H. Hodges took command of 1st Army. In 6 days, American forces had advanced further than they had in the previous 6 weeks combined. Columns were moving by tens of miles per day through open country, where the bocage had held them to hundreds of yards per day. The campaign that followed, the breakout and pursuit across France, did not erase the human cost of those 7 weeks in the hedgerows. The figures for the bocage fighting are staggering. The entire Normandy campaign from June 6 through mid-September 1944 cost the United States Army roughly 135,000 casualties. First Army's first 24 hours alone counted over 1,400 killed, nearly 2,000 missing, and 6,600 wounded. By early July, combined Allied casualties in the Normandy lodgement totaled roughly 60,000, including nearly 9,000 killed. The 29th Infantry Division, which bore some of the heaviest sustained fighting from Omaha Beach through Saint-Lô and beyond, would eventually accumulate over 20,000 battle casualties across its entire European campaign, a disproportionate share of them paid in the Norman hedgerows. The investigation into what had gone wrong and what could be done about it had been ongoing simultaneously with the fighting. It produced not one answer but many. Bradley's staff and the division commanders each reached somewhat different conclusions. Some emphasized the need for more infantry, some blamed inadequate tank infantry doctrine, some pointed to the failure to train on Norman-type terrain in England. The consensus that emerged was that a combination of factors had created a crisis that no single remedy could have prevented. The physical nature of the bocage, the aggressive German defensive doctrine, and the inadequate pre-invasion preparation for this specific terrain all bore responsibility. The Rhino device became the most famous symbol of the solution because it was concrete and dramatic and could be photographed. But General Bradley and the historians who later studied the campaign were careful to note that the device alone would not have broken the bocage. The shift in combined arms tactics, the integration of tank, infantry, engineer, and artillery into small assault teams, the tank infantry telephone system, the rehearsal behind the lines, the artillery forward observers embedded with every assault team, all of these developments were essential. The rhinoceros worked because the infantry knew how to use the gap it created, and the artillery knew how to suppress the far corners of the next field, and the engineers knew how to widen the breach, and the tank commander could talk directly to the squad leader on the ground. What the campaign revealed, in ways that shaped American military thinking for decades, was that the United States Army possessed a capacity for institutional adaptation under fire that its adversaries did not match. The Germans fought brilliantly in the bocage. Their individual soldiers and small unit commanders were skilled, aggressive, and difficult to dislodge. But their tactical system grew rigid under the weight of Hitler's insistence on holding ground and his interference in operational decisions, which prevented the kind of elastic response that might have adjusted German doctrine to the new threat. When the Rhino-equipped Shermans broke through behind the carpet bombing on July 25th, the German formations had no answer for tanks that could cross hedgerows in seconds and move across open country at speeds that outpaced any defensive adjustment. The legacy of what happened in Normandy's hedgerows lived on in military doctrine, in public memory, and in the soil of France itself. Near Cranford, New Jersey, Culin Drive carries the name of the sergeant whose welded steel tusks helped change the course of the war. The Cranford Historical Society erected a bronze plaque on a boulder outside the town's municipal building on North Union Avenue, installed in 1992 to commemorate his contribution. A man who never sought recognition, and who tried to share credit with the soldier whose offhand suggestion had started the whole thing, was remembered by the supreme commander of the Allied forces in Europe as one of the individuals whose ingenuity had helped win the war. In Normandy itself, the places where American soldiers bled and learned and ultimately broke through have been preserved and marked with care. The Normandy American Cemetery at Colleville-sur-Mer holds 9,389 graves in rows of white marble crosses and stars of David set on a bluff above Omaha Beach. Each year, on June 6th, and at other commemorations, veterans, families, and visitors from across the world gather there to remember the men who crossed the water and never came home. The Dead Man's Corner Museum at the Saint-Come-du-Mont Junction near Carentan preserves the physical landscape of the airborne fighting. The Overlord Museum near Omaha Beach displays vehicles and equipment from the Normandy campaign, including materiel from the hedgerow battles. The scholarship on the bocage campaign grew substantially in the decades after the war. The Combat Studies Institute at Fort Leavenworth commissioned Captain Michael D. Dubler's study, published in 1988 under the title Busting the Bocage, which became influential in the curriculum at the United States Army Command and General Staff College and at the Army War College. Dubler's broader 1994 study, Closing with the Enemy, How GIs Fought the War in Europe, extended the analysis across the full European theatre. The core argument of both works, that the United States Army demonstrated a remarkable capacity for bottom-up tactical innovation under combat conditions, became foundational to how the Army understood its own identity and its approach to adaptive learning in subsequent decades. The bocage also entered the military classroom as a case study in the consequences of terrain-specific unpreparedness, and in the way that junior leaders can generate solutions that institutional planners cannot foresee. The hedgerow campaign is regularly cited alongside Tarawa and the Kasserine Pass as an example of the painful price of encountering an unanticipated tactical problem for the first time in combat rather than in training. The United States Army's subsequent emphasis on realistic, terrain-specific field exercises owes something to the memory of what it cost to learn that lesson in the summer of 1944. For the farmers of Normandy, the hedgerows themselves told a different story after the war ended. The massive agricultural consolidations of the 1960s and 1970s, driven by incentives to modernize French farming, removed hundreds of thousands of kilometers of bocage across lower Normandy to create larger fields suitable for industrial machinery. The landscape that had defended German positions so effectively was reshaped by peacetime economics more thoroughly than wartime firepower had managed. Environmental advocates and historians documented the ecological losses, noting that the removal of these ancient earthen banks had increased runoff, accelerated erosion, and destroyed the habitat of hundreds of species that had lived in and around the bocage structures for centuries. Some Norman communities have since undertaken replanting projects, attempting to restore sections of the bocage, both for ecological reasons and as living historical monuments. The Normandy hedgerows did not care about any of this, of course. They had never been built for war, and they were not destroyed by it. They were built by farmers for farming, maintained by generations of Norman families for centuries, and then pressed into service, briefly and terribly, as fortifications in a battle that determined whether Western Europe would be liberated or remain occupied. They did their job on both sides simultaneously, killing Americans and sheltering Germans with the same indifference, until the Americans figured out how to take them apart. The story of the bocage is ultimately a story about the distance between what soldiers are trained to expect and what they actually find when they arrive on the ground. It is a story about the price paid when that distance is wide and the lessons have to be learned in blood. 7 weeks and tens of thousands of American casualties to advance 20 miles of Norman farmland. Then 6 days to advance more than they had in those 7 weeks combined, once the lesson had been learned. What made the difference was not superior equipment alone. The Sherman tank was outgunned by the Panther and the Tiger in most engagement categories. What made the difference was not superior numbers alone, though the Americans outnumbered the Germans significantly by late July. What made the difference was the capacity to look at a catastrophic failure, understand its causes without flinching from the cost, and rebuild doctrine around what the ground actually demanded rather than what the pre-war manuals had anticipated. A sergeant from New Jersey who had never studied engineering looked at the same earthen wall that had stopped a modern army for weeks and saw it as a problem to be solved with the materials at hand. He was right. The materials were German steel. The answer was 4 prongs and a welding torch. The result was a hole through a wall that the defenders had built their entire defensive system around. When the last Rhino-equipped Sherman rolled through the last Normandy Hedgerow in late July of 1944 and drove out into the open roads of Lower France, it carried with it not just a welded steel device, but a lesson about what armies can accomplish when the men fighting the war are trusted to solve the problems they are actually facing. The hedgerows that had been a death trap for 7 weeks had become, in the end, no more than a delay. The men who had learned that lesson, at enormous cost, made sure it was not forgotten. The war in Western Europe lasted until May 8, 1945. The bocage fighting was behind the American army by August of 1944, but the memory of those fields, those sunken lanes, those earthen walls, and the men who died crossing them one at a time, stayed with the soldiers who survived, and with the historians, families, and students who came after them. It stays with us still, not as a story of glory or of easy triumph, but as a story of what it costs to be unprepared, and what ordinary men can accomplish when necessity forces them to learn.